There's Charlie Nash driving the first Nash. Of course, again, unlike many, they did manage to survive the Great Depression, as we talked about before. Came up with some unique styling cars in the late 40s, the inverted bathtub look, if you will. Well, that happens to be one of my one of my toys, my little Metropolitan. And of course, as I mentioned before, they joined forces with Hudson to become American Motors. They bought the Jeep lineup in 1970. And American Motors, rather than compete headlong against the likes of Ford and General Motors, tried to make niche automobiles, including a couple of unique ones. The Gremlin. I find it interesting that the Gremlin was introduced to the public on April Fool's Day, 1970. I think that's quite appropriate. And of course, the Goldfish Bull, the Pacer. But AMC just couldn't compete. They didn't have the wherewithal to compete against the big three. Not to mention that Ford and Chevrolet got into a sales price cutting war to see who could be number one. That really did a world of hurt to the independent manufacturers. And AMC ultimately folded, and this is the last AMC built. American Motors was actually bought out by Chrysler later. Chrysler didn't want AMC, they wanted Jeep, which is still going strong. There's old Walter Chrysler himself. He again worked for Bill Durant, and the inevitable headbutting contest started. And Walter Chrysler left this $3 million a year job as president of General Motors and started his own company. Bought the Maxwell. Remember him? Jack Benny. Remember Jack Benny drove a Maxwell? Hey, don't get the Maxwell fired out. Anyway, Walter Chrysler bought the Maxwell company and introduced his own brand of automobiles. Of course, Chrysler is still going strong in business. Well, Walter Chrysler was negotiating to buy the Dodge lineup. They were having a protracted contracted negotiations, and he decided that maybe he would kind of push things along by saying, I'm going to create my own mid-price car. Well, it took so long for them to buy Dodge that he ultimately got stuck in a corner, and they introduced his other mid-price car, the DeSoto, named after Hernando DeSoto, of course, the explorer. And DeSoto was kind of a good solid car, not very distinguished until the late 50s or mid to late 50s under Virgil Exner's forward look, styling with the big fins. They did quite well until about 1958. I'm sure you probably remember the recession of 1958, pretty significant one. That hurt sales all over the place. Chrysler, in order to kind of help themselves along, the Chrysler company itself, motor car company, introduced the Chrysler Newport, which was really almost a DeSoto. Virtually the same car, rebadged DeSoto. Well, and it's basically the same price. Well, the Chrysler had a fancier name than DeSoto, so people bought Chryslers and not DeSotos. So the DeSoto they decided that DeSoto was no longer needed, and by 1960, the last of the 1961 model year DeSotos were built. Very few of those out there. They'd be worth some money today. And unlike Chrysler, who kind of competed with themselves, General Motors was led by Alfred Sloan. He was the president and chairman, and he tried to make sure his cars didn't compete with each other. He tried to put them in price niches so that there was no real much of an overlap between the cars. And the objective was, as you went up in expense, you got a little fancier car, a little more horsepower, a little nicer design, what have you. Well, after a while, this was the lineup in the late 20s. Oakland was in their lineup. Oakland was named after Oakland County, Michigan, where it was built. And pretty soon there were some gaps in there. And they decided Sloan decided to fill those gaps with what he called companion cars. And Oakland through Cadillac got a companion car. Cadillac got the LaSalle, named after the French explorer LaSalle, like Cadillac was a French explorer. This happens to be my other toy, my 37 LaSalle. They were built between 27 and 1940. By 1940, they were essentially the same as the Cadillac. The recession, or the Great Depression, was winding down, so the LaSalle was put out to pasture. The Viking was introduced right in the middle of the Great Depression. That was Oldsmobile's companion car. It didn't go anywhere. The Marquette was even worse. That was Buick's companion car. It only lasted 1 year. But Oakland's companion car was quite successful, and that was the Pontiac. Pontiac was introduced in 1926. It was a 6-cylinder car, sold for a 4-cylinder price. It was quite successful. When the Great Depression hit, it outsold its parent, Oakland, big time, to the point where Oakland disappeared and Pontiac took over Oakland's spot in the GM lineup. And there's examples of Pontiacs. This little guy right here, that's me, long time ago. Anyway, again, Pontiac was a good staid automobile, not particularly notable in many ways, good solid car until Bucky Knudsen and John DeLorean took over the company in the late 50s, and they went for the performance image. Bonneville Grand Prix GTO Le Mans that made Pontiac a very good performance image, and the cars sold extremely well. Unfortunately, as time went on, Bucky Knudsen and the performance image disappeared. They introduced in 2001 the Aztec, which if you look on your Google, the 10 ugliest cars ever built, invariably you'll find that one on there. The performance image went down the tubes. A lot of questionable design cars came out from Pontiac. A lot of rebadging, and again, when GM ran into problems in the early 2000s, they decided that Pontiac would be out the door too, and it was discontinued, and this was the last of the Pontiacs built. My favorite one, Plymouth. I like this story. When it was introduced, Plymouth was supposed to represent the honest endurance and integrity of the early Pilgrim forefathers. Great, looked good on paper, but that's not where the name came from. At the time, Walter Chrysler was sitting with his board of directors, kicking around what kind of name they would use for their low-priced automobile. And on the board of directors, a guy named Joe Frazier. Oh, wrong Joe Frazier. This Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier suggested the word Plymouth. And one of the other board members said, that's too puritanical. Well, Joe Frazier knew that Walter Chrysler was a farm boy. And he said, did you ever hear of Plymouth binding twine? Well, that's what they used to tie up hay bales. And Walter Chrysler said, hell, every damn farmer in America knows Plymouth binding twine. That's a good American name. So that's where the name came from, not from the Pilgrim forefathers, but a ball of string. Whereas Plymouth, they were a little more expensive than the Chevy and Ford, but they had some good engineering behind them. By the way, this is a very interesting concept car, the Plymouth Belmont. Only 2 of these built. One of these was owned by our member of our museum. And Plymouth was, again, using Raymond Loewy's design. The mid-50s Plymouths were very successful and very stylish. After that, styling became kind of passé. And by the 1990s, Plymouth and Dodge were building essentially the same product with the exception of this low production Prowler, which went under the Chrysler umbrella for a couple of years. And at this time, Chrysler had merged with Daimler, Mercedes-Benz, Daimler-Benz, and they decided that there was so much rebadging going on that either Plymouth or Dodge had to go. Well, Dodge had an independent dealerships, and Plymouth and Chrysler's were sold together. So to save the dealership network, they got rid of Plymouth, and Dodge was retained, and this is the last Plymouth that rolled off the production line. The Neon, the Dodge Neon was the same car with the exception of the name plate. And this is the last of the Plymouth. When any car company goes out of business, there's a lot of sadness. People who built them, people who sold them, the people who bought them. But in the case of Plymouth, there was another entity that was very unhappy, and that was God. Because God, as you know, if you read the Bible, you know God drove a Plymouth. Right? Sure. It says so right there. And God drove Adam and Eve from the Garden of Paradise in a fury. Everybody knows it. So God was unhappy too. And I mentioned Joe Frazier. He ultimately left Chrysler joined with Henry J. Kaiser to build the Kaiser Frasers. You probably remember those from the late 40s, early 50s. They were a pretty good car, but again, had difficulty competing against the big three. And they didn't last too long. In fact, Joe Fraser told Henry Kaiser, "You're building too many cars, you can't sell them that fast." And Henry Kaiser didn't listen. Joe Fraser left. And Joe Fraser was right. Henry outsold or outproduced what he could sell, and ultimately he failed too. They even tried selling them a rebadged version of the Henry J. There's the Henry J down here in the corner, as the Allstate, which was sold by Sears. Essentially the same car, a little bit of modification to the grille, and it had Allstate tires and batteries and that kind of stuff in it. Didn't sell very well. And ultimately, they went out of business, although Fraser or Kaiser moved his production facilities to Argentina. And as you can see, the likeness of the about 53, 54 Kaiser in what was known as the Carabella. And that was quite a successful car in South America for a number of years. And the last one, I bet you're glad to hear this. This is the last one, Mercury. Mercury was really was really a child of Edsel Ford, who kept bugging old Henry that he needed a mid-price car to compete against the likes of Buick and Dodge. Finally, Henry conceded, and Edsel created the Mercury, which was named